My name is Vivek Reddy, and I'm from the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. So ADVENT is a trial looking at patients with paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. It's the first randomized trial comparing pulse field to conventional ablation. It's looking at a technology, the FARAPULSE pentaspline catheter, which was the first pulse field ablation catheter used in clinical practice and first in human studies. That catheter is approved here in Europe, but does not have regulatory approval in the United States. So in addition to being the first randomized trial, it's also a regulatory or pivotal trial in the United States. The trial is also interesting because it is a single blind trial, so patients were blinded to their treatment assignment until the end of the trial. In ADVENT, the primary endpoint was met. If you look at the 1-year success in pulse field, it was 73% versus 71% in conventional ablation, and this did meet the pre-specified criteria for non-inferiority, with the posterior probability exceeding 99.9%. And we were quite pleased with this. Remember, this is the first time that the majority of these operators had ever touched this PFA catheter, and of course, they've done literally thousands of conventional thermal ablation procedures. So despite that, the success rate was nominally higher and certainly statistically non-inferior. But I think it'd be interesting to think about the fact that these operators did not have experience with the pulse field ablation technology versus doing thousands of thermal ablation technologies. So one wonders what will happen a few years from now after operators do have experience with pulse field ablation if we repeated such a trial, perhaps looked even more carefully with implantable loop recorders for looking even at subtle differences in efficacy, we might see some differences. But again, this is somewhat speculative and we have to wait for those kind of studies to be done. So this is the first randomized trial with this PFA catheter in the United States. But this catheter has been approved in Europe for just over 2 years. And it's interesting to look at some of those outcomes. So recently we published the Manifest PF Efficacy study, which looked at the first 1,500 plus patients undergoing pulse field ablation in Europe. And there's also a Euphoria registry looking at a subset of those centers with similar numbers of patients. And what we saw in both studies were, again, good efficacy. In the hands of almost 100 operators, we see efficacy consistent with what we've seen in ADVENT. So I think that bodes well. We also saw excellent safety with Manifest. So I think, again, this bodes well for the potential introduction of this technology into the United States after approval. The treatment paradigm for AF is changing, and there are a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is unrelated to technology, but rather important clinical trials that have demonstrated the importance of rhythm control in atrial fibrillation. Add on top of that a number of clinical trials showing that first-line ablation is more effective than antiarrhythmic drugs, as well as delays progression of the disease process. Add on top of that this new technology, pulse field ablation, which has reduced procedure time, at least as good efficacy and perhaps greater, and a safety profile that's at least as good, and certainly something that both physicians and patients don't have to worry about the most serious complications, atrial esophageal fistula and pulmonary vein stenosis. The overall safety event rate was similar in ADVENT between the pulse field ablation and the thermal group. But when you think about the operator experience and what the operator has to worry about, there are important differences. For example, with thermal ablation, you have to worry about damage to the esophagus, so you have to do esophageal temperature monitoring or displacement or some strategy to protect the esophagus. With the phrenic nerve, you have to do phrenic pacing or again, some strategy to avoid damage. With regards to pulmonary vein stenosis, you have to be very careful that you're not too far inside the vein. So we're always using these various strategies with conventional ablation. But with pulse field ablation, we don't think about any of this. There is no temperature monitoring or phrenic pacing or worrying about the catheter being too far inside the vein. You achieve the same safety outcomes without these concerns, which I think is great for both patients and physicians. If we look at the efficiency of the procedure, there were significant differences between the two groups. Pulse field ablation procedures took less time in terms of overall procedure time. If you look at left atrial dwell time, the time the catheter spent in the left atrium, it was significantly less, and the amount of ablation time is less. And if you think about why is there better efficiency, I think there are multiple reasons. One is the fact that pulse field ablation is very quick. You're not taking multiple seconds or minutes to create each lesion, but literally within a couple of seconds. Number two, you're not doing point-by-point ablation, for example, with RF, or with cryo, freezing, waiting for the freeze, waiting for the thaw. It's just much quicker with pulse field. So I think there are a number of reasons why the procedure is much more efficient with pulse field.